P. Fight back, Wildcat, read all about it. Get your challenge here. Challenge the communist paper. That's right, the communist paper. Fight back, Wildcat, overthrow the government. Get your challenge here.
I am here with the PLP and my comrade here. And we are here to talk about the history of Christianity, how Christianity plays a reactionary role today, and religion more generally.
The origin of Christianity.
Yeah, and its relationship to the communist movement and how it's the good, bad, and ugly. The Progressive Labor Party, we do organizing within transportation all over the United States, and is an international party that organizes all over the world. We've led strikes in New York that have even shut down New York before. We've fought fascists and even organized during the Vietnam War against the war machine. So before we go into it, I just wanted to read this, what our stance on religion is. Okay, communism means that the minds of the millions of workers must become free from religion's false promises, unscientific thinking, and poisonous ideology. Communism will triumph when the masses of workers can use the science of dialectical materialism to understand, analyze, and change the world to meet their needs and aspirations. Okay, so now that we got that over with.
And that's right out of the Challenge newspaper.
Yes.
It's in the
yes.
in the Our Fight section.
Yes. So, we're organizing for a revolution, and let's talk about Christianity and communism and its relationship. We're talking here about Engels' book on the history of early Christianity. We both read this in preparation for this talk. Let's just give a quick summary. First, he talks about a lot of similarities between early Christianity and communists. Both of them had a lot of martyrs. I mean, if we talk about Christians, it's pretty self-evident about that is how many people sacrifice themselves in order to try to spread the faith. Mm-hmm. But you have communists and leftists, the whole Haymarket massacre, or all of the people that have died. Whether you want to talk about Che or Rosa Luxemburg, obviously we don't condone cults of personality around. These people were people, but it is impressive. But that is a notable similarity. He also talks about how easily Christians and communists were both taken advantage of historically. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how many leftists fall for NGOs, or there might be some random person who asks for money online, and they just genuinely, their heart bleeds for them. Now, obviously, a good leftist or a good communist isn't donating to that whole Coney 2012 or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it was 2012.
People who care. Another good example, there are a lot of communists who will join stuff that are cults, and they'll lose a lot of their money will go towards that. The RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, with Bob Avakian, is a cult. Now, obviously, that's not always true. The other stuff that he talked about was how Christianity was a religion of slaves and refugees and the poor, that it had a very utopian socialist characteristic, very idealist. And even though you see this even in early American history too, of a lot of Christians kind of just trying to build a little commune or whatnot, without kind of thinking of the larger economics powers at play. He talked about how we look for salvation on earth, whereas the Christians look for it in the afterlife. Basically saying we look for a better world here, whereas they look for a better world after they die. He put a lot of emphasis on how Revelations in the book of John was part of early Christianity.
I would like to clarify. It's written by John, but it's not the book of John, and it's not like First John or Second John. It's Revelations, and the author is John, who's supposedly written. Yeah. It's supposedly written by the other Johns, but it's not. Or at least we don't actually think it is.
He said in the essay that they think it was written by John, right?
Well, like a John figure, and what that means is anthropologists have determined that at the time, 1800s, they determined that Revelations was written in the late 60s. For all we know, that's the earliest glimpse into what early Christianity looked like. And the rest of New Testament books, and even a lot of the Old Testament books, Daniel, were written much later. For example, Daniel was written later to quote-unquote predict the rise of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, even though you're not predicting anything if that's history.
Well, it's a good trick to get people to listen to you if you lie and say, oh, I was written much earlier, and then predict something that has already happened, and then it gives more power to my predictive abilities.
Yeah, of course.
For claims that haven't happened yet.
We don't want to get too off track, but basically, Engels points out that he thinks Daniel was written in the past the 60 AD decade, kind of lead the way for the rest of the books of the New Testament. But anyway, it appears it was written by some founding father of Christianity because of the way that he talks to the 12 churches.
Well, it's a cleric. It's somebody who's learned and has some kind of position or authority in the church.
Yeah. Whereas
you were saying how a lot of these other books we don't really know necessarily.
Yeah, they could be like copies of other copies. We just we're not really sure when they originated. We're not sure what the original one looked like.
Yeah, and they could be obscure academics or clergy rather than actual somebody with high standing. You know?
Exactly. But so, anyways, this is a glimpse into, because he is in this position of like a leading member of the church. Through Revelations, we have a glimpse into what Christianity looked like then, essentially. Anyways. Back to what you were saying.
Another thing that they talked about is how in Revelations, book of John.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. There we go. See, you can tell
I
was not
written by John.
Yeah, you can tell that I was not raised as a Christian. That he referred to the people in that book as Jews. There was no Christians, which is very telling of how early it was. Another thing Engels talks about is how there was no Trinity before the Council of Nicaea. Did you want to talk about that kind of quickly?
Sure. In Revelations, John does talk about God, what most Christians now call God the Father. And then there was Jesus, the Lamb, who is more on the standing of Moses or Abraham or one of the great Judaic prophets. The key point with that is he's subordinate to God, now what we call the Father, because he wasn't God. He was just a prophet. And the Holy Spirit didn't exist either. The only reference to a spirit was the 12 spirits of God for 12 churches of God, of Christianity. And we would interpret that as the 12 is just like a part of the numerology of Judeo-Christian religion. The 12 disciples of Jesus, the 12 tribes of Israel, all that stuff. But the key point is there is no one single spirit. There is no one Holy Spirit in this case.
And Jesus is more on the same rung as the other prophets, like Moses.
But long story short, there's only one God. There's no Trinity.
Yes, and this is really important to understanding how, from like a factual perspective, Christianity is bunk, but it's also demonstrates how everything has a history and changes, whether we're talking about religion or ideology. And a lot of times these religions are very static and essentialist and unchanging with how they understand the world, and they act like it was always that way when that's just not true. One thing that he talked about is how there was no sacrifices in Christianity, early Christianity, but that as it was adopted by Europeans at the time were very into sacrifice, so they developed communion. Because Europeans and pagan mythology was so much into sacrifice that they needed this ritual that kind of relived the sacrifice. Another thing he talks about, I thought this was really funny, was that a lot of Christians were pretty sectarian at the time, and certain people in the First International could be sometimes sectarian. I thought that was really funny. Another thing was that John declared that the world was ending, what was it, blessed they readeth or something like that. But you see this throughout Christianity, and it kind of makes sense because you constantly have people persecuting the Jews and the Christians and whatnot in Rome, and so you constantly have this feeling of the world ending. But obviously this is replayed over the last 2,000 years of the history of Christianity, because I mean, how many times have we heard that the world is ending from Christian? You know?
Yeah, and I mean, like, as we'll get to later, a big issue was Rome. 666 referred to the Kaiser Nero. And you could probably see when the Roman Empire was collapsing, they thought the end of the world was happening for the better, because they hated Rome.
Yeah, although that's like 400 or 500 years after John's revelation.
Yeah, there's just so much happening in the last 2,000 millennia that they could call the end of the world.
Two last things. One was that Rome was so powerful that the only way out of Rome for a lot of these Christians in their mind was the conclusion that they might have drawn is through some kind of religion, some kind of afterlife. And then the other thing that I thought was really fascinating was that many people in Greece worshipped Jupiter and Arcadia and various polytheistic multiple gods up until the 9th century. And these people still called themselves Christian, too, which I thought was really fascinating.
Could I interject for a second?
Yeah.
I'm no expert in Catholicism, but you can definitely see some of the remnants of that polytheism. You see
Saints.
Yes, praying to the saints. It's almost they're part of the deity.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think talking to Catholics, they would probably still say that they aren't gods. It still mirrors that polytheistic model, at the very least.
Well, don't tell a Catholic, though, that they're polytheistic.
Yeah. I'm sure a lot of this is like a Protestant Catholic beef kind of.
Yeah. I'm more of a lamb person than beef, but you know. Anyway.
Well, there is something that has to do with sexism. That's not a parallel with communism. At least we hope it isn't. But just that the early Christians were very misogynist.
Yes. He literally said, what was it, over the 40,000...
So John mentions in, I believe it was chapter 14 of Revelations, that the 144,000 people, these were the first fruits of humanity. They were all virgins because they were untouched by a woman. And later theologians tried to twist this into, God is just talking about not worshiping other gods. But looking at this from a naive perspective, which is what we probably should be doing since this is the original document without all the other Corinthians and all the other books added onto it later, this speaks of misogyny. It's like this idea that sex in itself defiles a human. Specifically, sex with a woman defiles a man.
Yeah. Well, and just this constant... the whore of Babylon kind of talk, and we could be here all day if we wanted to talk about misogyny in the Bible. But part of the beginnings of slave society, and is a reoccurring theme, was using women to increase the productive capacity and war capacity of a given state. It's mainly in the slave empires, but the norms established there continued. And of course, different class societies, especially capitalism, have really helped divide the working class on the basis of gender. The next thing is, what would we replace religion with, and how would we replace it? I think that's a very old question for atheists and communists. I mean, I think we replace it with international solidarity and historical materialism and dialectical materialism. And part of that is studying the history of philosophy and how things change. How does emergence happen? How, as quantity changes, does it actually become a new thing? Whether we're talking about the temperature changing and how that changes fundamentally liquid water into ice, or we're talking about a gang becoming an army, or whether we're talking about how do things combine and react to one another, and how, if we're talking about dialectics, how do things co-evolve? If we're talking about the mongoose and the snake, Because, like, a lot of times people will just be, why can't we just build communism?
Mm-hmm.
And then I have to explain to them how we have a lot of people that are preventing us from building communism, and that's the whole point of the state, is to make sure that the bourgeois remain in power.
Well, in a capitalist state.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Well, that's what a capitalist state does.
Well, I know, but, like, you know, a state could be
Yeah,
socialist.
well, yeah.
I'm just nitpicking.
Well, I mean, but the whole thing is that we have to suppress our enemies.
Yes.
And that's, in this conflict between classes, a state will arise from that. Because you will need a military or even some kind of prison to deal with the reactionaries and some kind of apparatuses. But when we're talking about dialectics, one thing that's important is that we can look at a fascist and try to understand their ideology in opposition to us. And same thing with us in opposition to them. I would say less so for us. I think we kind of exist in opposition to the bourgeois. But part of how we get hardened and our understanding of the world will change as we fight the fascists in a series of revolutions and maybe civil wars and stuff. That'll definitely change our perspective. Things are dynamic. And again, read Maurice Cornforth's Materialism and the Dialectical Method. But I think one thing we thought about was how a lot of religion will go away over time, and maybe even spirituality, a lot of spirituality will go away over time, as the school systems are controlled by communists. I think teaching children about certain aspects about human anatomy and how consciousness changes as the brain changes and as certain material conditions, whether inside or outside that human changes. You know, obviously, we don't reduce consciousness to just the brain.
Yeah.
We're not like that. That's naive. Most of it is actually nurture. But if you look at how somebody who might suffer from dementia or a head injury, it changes their consciousness, and over time, and I'm not referring to class consciousness, but over time, as you might see somebody who has dementia, they lose their faculties, and there's kind of a continuity between their consciousness before they have dementia and eventually their death. It provides evidence that there is no afterlife. And you can also teach kids about the history of religion and the history of ideology as an anthropology. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to comment that we also look at the class component of religion and how it's used to enforce certain paradigm. When we're not in a communist society or society moving towards communism, you won't have this defeatist attitude that, oh, well, we can't have things nice here, and we just look to heaven. Heaven is this incentive to live in the dreary world of capitalism.
But we can't be comfortable here.
Yes.
We have to suffer as a trial, and then we get to go to heaven afterwards.
Yeah, and it also defeats revolutionary spirit, too, because most people that are suffering, working class people are suffering, if they didn't think there was an afterlife, they'd be like, what is all this for? I'm going to rebel.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and so what I'm getting at is those components just won't be there. There won't be these things supporting and propping up religion anymore. So it, together with education and stuff, we can hypothesize that it should just kind of wither away.
I make a distinction between spirituality and religion. I would say that religion is more of an institution and will always have a class character. Spirituality could just be the idiosyncrasies of somebody's belief. You know, they might believe in ghosts, they might believe in some kind of thing that, let's say they think that rainforest is conscious or something like that. I mean, that's unfalsifiable currently. But I think some of that will always exist, and I don't think it's always a bad thing, but it shouldn't necessarily be promoted in academic institutions. And obviously we need to get rid of the institution of religion. That's what I would say is more important than beliefs that are maybe unscientifically founded. Now, I mean, those will go away too more, but sometimes there might be some kind of mythology a certain town might have that I don't think is always the most harmful, but more or less we shouldn't be encouraging Santa.
Yes, and I think in general we're pretty much agreement on that. I do think as party members or for party members, especially pre and during revolution, it is important to throw away as many vestiges of that spirituality as possible because it just doesn't support a dialectical materialist analysis as well. It just doesn't make you as an effective revolutionary. But in general, pretty neutral. Yeah, believing in ghosts or something it's not on the same level as religion, which has like a very clear class component to it.
I guess one quick intermediate question is, do you think that there would be some continuity from the institutions that we see today?
You mean like Catholic?
Maybe not the Catholic Church, but maybe like Quakers or something.
Oh, yeah. Somewhat more speculation, but I guess I could see maybe certain churches that align themselves with communist movements, say liberation theology, churches. We might think they're incorrect into some of them, but if they're aligned with us in a revolution, they're allies. Maybe we're not going to compromise from a strict dialectical materialist view, but we might partner with them tactically. And they might stay around for a while. Maybe we try to wither them away in some sort. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I think we both disagree with opportunism, but it's more of as certain dialectical materialist teachings and communism become normalized, that different religions might start change over time and start adopting certain kinds of notions that are brought from...
I hadn't even thought of that. That's an interesting point.
Well, I just want to say, warning, this is utopian to speculate exactly about the future, but...
we can speculate as long as it's not utopian as long as you assume that you could be completely wrong. This is just our best guess.
Yeah, we're shooting in the dark.
Yeah, and this shouldn't maybe determine policy.
But I think it depends, is there a rebellion within the church? Because obviously the clergy are petty bourgeois.
Yeah.
In general, some of them are straight up bourgeois, but in general, they're petty bourgeois. I mean, they help provide meaning to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, that serves class society. Okay, so the next...
Oh, yeah, when you're talking about churches emerging and stuff like that, I think I don't want to throw too many speculations because I think this is a question I would want to consult some more experienced party members, their opinion on this.
We're party members, so of course, everybody's going to collaborate, but it's not...
Okay, yeah, I guess I'm just kind of curious.
What other people think.
I've never talked to anyone about this. I can see a lot of Marxists saying, no, we're not to keep any religious institution because they're reactionary to the extreme.
Yeah. I guess the next question that I might ask in just relationships, what is our current orientation to churches as communists? Because obviously, if you're talking to a religious person that's somewhat class conscious, at least with economistic demands, they realize their boss is screwing them. But you don't want to necessarily, the first thing that you say is Christianity is a lie and that everything you're being taught is keeping you to prevent from being revolting.
Or go back to those anti-theists, new atheists, sky daddies. It's just like rude.
Well, it's not only rude. I feel like the way that they understand religion is profoundly wrong. But we'll get to that too.
Yeah, we'll talk about it.
I think what I would say is that it depends on what's going on in the church. If they have some kind of program that's after services where they're actively trying to help the poor, there might be a potential to organize or get people to communism there. Now, obviously, first and foremost, you organize workers in their workplace, because that's the root of power. This isn't just about helping people or doing charity. The real helping people is creating a society where people don't need to be helped. There may be people who are genuinely interested in fundamentally transforming society and becoming a communist if maybe there's a youth group, maybe there's a anti-racist action group. Some of those people can be very radical, and they understand that the police are our enemies, and there's a real potential to get them to become a communist. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and then of course on the other hand you have prosperity gospel churches and mega churches, and I think we can pretty easily say that those are lost causes. They're just bastions of reactionary ideology.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing if somebody comes up to you and genuinely is interested in it, but in general, a lot of these churches are very petty bourgeois or even just bourgeois, and especially the one, as my comrade said, prosperity gospel ones, very anti-communist. Well, actually, explain what the prosperity gospel is.
My understanding, I've never really gone to one. I think everyone I knew had enough foresight to see the BS in it. But basically, the idea is that the more you give, the more you get in return. And what you end up is, well, part of this, there's the material incentive for the church. They're trying to get their churchgoers to donate more. And so they really hone in on this idea. And then the other part is there's just extreme linkage between success, economic success, and being a good Christian. Like the idea is, if you are a good Christian, you should be successful. And in some ways, vice versa. If you're successful, that kind of the implication is that means God favors you. And that can just create this fetishization of wealth, and which is very pro-capitalist.
Yeah, it sounds sick.
Yeah.
And not in like the skater way, like sick. You know?
Yeah.
Very
like the vomit sick.
yeah.
Taking advantage of people sick.
Yes.
I guess one other thing I wanted to add about the churches thing, the churches we do want to get involved with is churches serve the poor, but they're also part of the poor.
Yes.
For example, the churches that slaves went to in the U.S. pre-abolition, those are the churches that are the most radical.
Yeah,
like
well,
those,
I mean,
like
John Brown.
Yeah.
Brown, John Brown and Nat Turner. What inspired Nat Turner's rebellion was religion.
Churches that are radical like that, those are the churches where we would probably want to get involved with their outreach services.
Yeah.
And talking to people and trying to win them to Communism.
Yeah. Well, and again, organized workers in the workplace, but there's definitely some potential, especially some of these programs, because a lot of people who are in these organizations, they might be good people who actually are tired of being exploited by their boss. And at the end of the day, we're trying to build a mass movement, so you can't just completely dismiss Christians.
One more positive thing about them is just a lot of religion is very practice-oriented. It's not just about, let's think about the essence of God. It's about how do we treat one another. And there is this real basis of organizing. You have all these regular interactions and like community outreach in some way and helping each other with some form of mutual aid. These are all positive aspects that can be admired, even though only some churches are accessible to us.
There are some people who, obviously I want to help people, but again, we want to create a society where people don't need to be helped, and sometimes people get focused on their action of personally helping someone. Now that can eventually, that striving to try to help the poor and understand the poor can sometimes turn into a fight for communism. Mm-hmm. But helping people isn't inherently a strive for communism. There has to be some kind of class conflict where you're actively fighting the bourgeois and understand the need for a classless, moneyless society. But there's definitely a lot of potential in their empathy.
Yeah, I mean, this is talked about in Lenin's What Is to Be Done with Economism, but we could talk about that polemic for another day.
Yeah. So I had this friend who said that religion is like a knife. You can use it to spread butter or you can use it to stab someone. What do you think of that?
Ooh, that screams of like a right opportunism. Just trying to find some way to work with the religious groups.
And keeping the religion intact.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I don't think fundamentally religion is an instrument of class domination.
You mean that person that says that doesn't understand that?
Yes, exactly. And the line that will work best is the materialist line. We understand that churches or religion, you have had like religion of slaves, early Christianity, but that ultimately didn't work because it's utopian. The only methodology that will lead to true liberation is one that's based in materialism.
Well, but I think it's important to realize that I wouldn't even say Christianity was much of a religion until the Council of Nicaea. And then it was institutionalized. It was kind of more of these random spiritualities that kind of, people that weren't as codified. And it wasn't only until it got adopted by the state and the masters and the slave society as a whole that it became this weaponized against the working class.
Yeah, I agree that the Council of Nicaea was that. I think, it's backed up. by the history. But just because it's not monolithic doesn't mean it isn't religion, quote unquote. It's a little more than spirituality. Mm-hmm. Even though it's very not monolithic at all. Of course, after the Council of Nicaea, that's the refined religion to subjugate the slaves and the poor.
Yeah, well, and maintaining Rome and eventually feudalism and whatnot. Yeah. One thing, because when I hear that stab versus butter or whatever, they might say, oh, look at the Catholics who are giving food to the poor. Like Mother Teresa, that there's some honor and poverty.
Mother Teresa is like a terrible person.
Yeah. A lot of these charities that work, like help people through the Catholic Church, they're helping the Catholic Church look good. Meanwhile, at the very least, there's this there's pedophilia and money laundering on a massive scale. But from a Marxist perspective, who is the people who ordain all the kings and emperors?
Who sided with the fascists?
Yeah, but I mean, it's just literally these clergy work for class society and justify the things as they are. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't revolt because then you don't need to revolt because you're going to get your due in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. It's just not recognizing how, especially those notions of the afterlife are weaponized against the working class and trying to say that morality is outside of humanity. And how these monks, these priests, these clergy have worked alongside, whether we're talking about the masters, the lords, and now the capitalists.
It's mighty convenient that the morality that's like above us all is the one of the capitalists or of the ruling class.
Yes.
They would rationalize it as we shouldn't be revolting because then we're killing people.
Yeah.
Because that's immoral, but the killing of police officers killing other people because that's illegal, that's not immoral.
Or like eviction.
Yeah, or eviction.
Yeah. In fact, even some libertarians or maybe even some people who are hyper really believe in property above all else, they might even say that the person who is being evicted is committing the violence by not refusing to leave their property, which is absurd.
Yeah, because they're not following the contract.
Yeah. Everything is in terms of property. The Virginia Constitution and Thomas Jefferson's writings is life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Mm-hmm. Or was it life, liberty, and property or something like that?
Well, that was the beginning of the Constitution. Yeah,
and also John, he was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, they revised it to make it more...
Yeah, and I think John Locke and some of the other, OG, original gangster liberals, it was very explicit. And if you do any amount of research in the law, most of law is about just maintaining property.
Yeah. Property
relations, mitigating between capitalists or keeping the proles from taking what's theirs.
Early patent law and stuff like that.
Oh yeah. No, patent law is actually a good example too. We have a list of questions. What's the first question?
What is the history of Christianity and its positive origins too?
Well, originally it was a religion of slaves and refugees, and it was about fighting the Roman Empire.
Yes, very specifically the Roman Empire. Engels writes on this pretty thoroughly on the history of early Christianity. He wrote it in, I guess, 1894. But yeah, he details how it's a religion created by current slaves, former slaves, workers that are in debt.
Yeah.
They're practically slaves because they're so in debt.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically a reaction to the Roman Empire.
Well, in a lot of ways, it's it's a very utopian socialist understanding of the world, and these people were so oppressed that the only way they could understand their liberation was in the afterlife, making an afterlife. They were pretty screwed, it's think about trying to fight Rome. There's no coming back after Rome conquers your country.
Yeah.
It's But it's
I mean, part of it I think is, I wouldn't even say that they're just so conquered. I mean, like, a lot of international movements are so conquered by colonialism and imperialism, but I would say the big thing is that the science hadn't been developed yet to, like, understand class struggle, like, throughout history, and also, like, productive forces hadn't been created yet, or, like, hadn't been developed enough where you could have, you know, like, the proletariat in any form, or you just didn't have this rise of, like, the formalized version of science.
Yeah.
You know? Like, everything was still veiled in some form of, like, religion. You know?
Yeah, well, and by the time... So, I mean, it was something for the lower classes to revolt against the upper classes, but by the time, like, the Council of Nicaea comes around, they start formalizing it, and it becomes part of a way to justify slavery, to... you know, justify class society, which we see today.
Yeah.
What was that? What was it? There's a specific thing where, like, Paul was like, "Yeah, slaves, you got to obey your masters."
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, it was written by Paul. Slaves, obey your masters. That's like kind of a Ephesians 6:5.
Yeah.
Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ.
Yeah.
And you know, of course, that whole passage goes on about, okay, well, you masters, they need to be kind to the slaves too.
Yeah.
But you're still
gentle.
justifying slavery, and it would be if today we're like, oh, you capitalists, you need to treat us workers good, but workers, you need to be a good worker. Don't steal from your boss.
Yeah.
Don't go on strikes. You're cutting away from their bottom line. We should just be in harmony. Don't unionize. Be harmless. Submit to the current order.
Well, and this promise of an afterlife, and quote, the meek shall inherit the earth.
Yeah.
Or whenever you put morality outside of humanity, we don't have an obligation to change society for the better.
Yeah, because this is like all... I would say I see it as, and I think most Marxists see it as...
material.
Yeah, it's based off of material and economic conditions.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I mean, even a lot of anti-racism is based off of working with people of different nationalities and ethnicities.
Yeah.
Or if we look at different understandings of consent, come back to stuff like John Locke and the bourgeois struggle against the feudal lords. And that philosophy also rubbed off on us to a certain extent. If somebody's working with a forklift and you're depending on them, and you're like, maybe somebody will get yelled at, or if there's a mistake, somebody might be, you're trusting them, you know, with your lives sometimes, you know, often. So it's not, but it's, you know, morality, while it's subjective, or I would even say material, even like, rather than talking about subjective or objective, I would say it's material. It's based in class struggle and, you know, the material circumstances. Egoism and altruism have a history that's based in survival, and a lot of our law and our understanding of morality today is bourgeois. Back then, in the time of Christianity, it was back in the time of slave society and feudal society, was Christianity. Can we have morality without religion?
The great morality question.
Do communists have morality?
I think we kind of did touch on this, but we kind of wanted to expound on that a little bit and sharpen our line on what it is.
I would say that morality is material. Sometimes people will talk about subjective or objective. I would say it's material, and it's based in labor. It's based in class struggle. You could take any number of documents, whether we're talking about the Constitution or the Magna Carta, that was class struggle. That was the barons versus the king and lords that supported him. Or if you want to talk about the Constitution, you can talk about the vestiges of feudalism in England and the British bankers versus the American capitalists, who were people who owned slaves and plantations, and the merchants. A lot of times people will talk about egoism and altruism. But if we look at egoism and altruism, they're part of a history of survival, and they're related to ecology and economics.
But it's not this platonic form.
Yeah.
It's like outside of humanity, and it's just this truth about us.
Yes. It's something that develops, and it's rooted in labor and class struggle. If we look at how the bourgeois understand morality, a lot of it is about protecting their property and understanding things in relationship to ownership. If we talk about my body, my choice, that statement, that comes back to like John Locke, where he would talk about freedom in terms of ownership. You own your own body, therefore. In reality, I don't think ownership is not the basis of whether people should be able to control their own body. It's human liberation, and in that case, usually it's women's liberation. For instance, why is the proletariat often anti-racist? And why should communists be anti-racist? Because I was just thinking about this, and like, obviously I have a deep sense of that all people are equal. It doesn't matter your melanin or pigments or certain phenotypes or whatever. And like this strong emotional feel that I have, that regardless of whether it's a Chinese baby or an American baby or a Guatemalan baby, their cries are the same. Or we could go on about these poetic moralisms and talk about how Shakespeare,
The Merchant of Venice.
Venice, where he says, prick us do we not bleed. Where he's saying, as a Jew, don't I bleed like you? But that's not really getting at where does this moral notion come from. And I was thinking about it, and there's 3 things that I could point to specifically that would form my opinion, and other people's opinions too on this.
So, just to outline them, there's production, there's the market, and there's the proletarian struggle.
Well, yes, international solidarity for revolution. Thank you. So the first one I'll talk about is production. If you have a man who's from East Asia is working with a man from South America or who's Hispanic, and they're working on a construction site, and one of them has to hold the ladder, that creates solidarity. They have to trust each other with their lives. And so there's no other choice but to be anti-racist there and appreciate that person's work and who they are as a worker. And of course it goes beyond that. There's camaraderie built there.
And you can even see with reactionary people, they will still speak very highly of people they've worked with. They
that's
might
an
have
interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, but even people that are very conservative, they have all these ideas about immigrants being dirty and stuff. They'll still admire immigrant workers for being such hard workers, and they also just trust them.
Yeah, which is kind of a contradiction. It's amazing how the capitalist media will put them against each other, because at the end of the day, the person that they're working with, they're no different. They're trying to make a livelihood here, and they're hard workers. People don't move thousands of miles because they just on a whim. It's a very small percentage. Most of these people are economic refugees. And so I think, yes, there are some conservatives and people who try to compartmentalize, but a lot of people, I think, learn anti-racism by just spending a lot of time amongst different people and working with them. If I am working with a black person and they are using a forklift at my workplace, I trust them with my life to a certain extent, and there's no choice otherwise. And same thing vice versa. And same thing in public transit. We have to trust each other because part of it is this is how we get our food and our livelihood. And we can obviously see each other's humanity. I mean, a lot of this racist shit just goes back to phrenology and these just arbitrary groupings of phenotypes that we might associate with certain continents. Now, obviously, there's a history behind those and why certain groups were kind of put into certain classes or associate with certain classes or certain material conditions. But let's go on to the second one. The second one is the market. In bourgeois society, how they understand a person's value is how much money can be made from it. Whether we're talking about through trade or exploitation or whatever, they don't care what race or if you're trans or what religion you are, as long as you make them money. Whether they're exploiting you or whether trading with them as another capitalist. Now, obviously, the bourgeois, this is a very simple anti-racism, that they undermine themselves. There's a history of bourgeois and capitalists promoting racism between workers to prevent them from organizing. I mean, you see that on the West Coast with the fruit pickers before Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, which we do not condone them. I mean, they were very... specifically Cesar Chavez, he actually facilitated the deportation of undocumented people, but that's not here nor there. Throughout the history of fruit pickers, starting in the 1930s, you have a migration of the Okies and Arkies that you hear about in, I think, The Grapes of Wrath. But there was a lot of black and white people who were sharecroppers, very poor, who went into California, and they were put against each other based off their race, but also you have various waves of immigrants, whether we're talking about Mexicans or Japanese people or the Filipinos that were put against each other to prevent them organizing and striking.
And that lowers wages.
Yeah, and that lowers wages.
There's all these competing reasons to promote racism or to be anti-racist, quote unquote,
by the bourgeois.
Yeah, and it's all about increasing profits, of course.
Yeah, well, you see even the way that capitalists orients themselves to Black Lives Matter. It's become a brand.
But anyways, that, to summarize, just that doesn't form how we see race, and especially liberals.
I think it affects us a bit. When we're in school, they teach us about a watered-down version of Martin Luther King. I would say at the end of the day, though, if you see somebody who's a racist, they've obviously overcome that liberal notion of anti-racism.
For the worse.
For the worse, yeah. And that's because the way that our society works often kneecaps people of color, specifically indigenous people and black people. And you can have somebody who was raised in an anti-racist liberal household where they introduced them to many different cultures and different people, and they tried to teach them about different histories of different people. And in the long term, they still see how minorities and black people, there's like more crime or certain metrics are worse off in those communities, and they don't have a materialist analysis. They might explain that through racism without realizing that the real root of those causes is stuff like the prison industrial complex and inheritance. That's where racism comes from. It's not, we can't just tell people that all people are equal. You have to give people a materialist analysis, and you have to also make a world where people are materially not kneecapped and have access to education and clean water and aren't harassed by the police regularly. But anyway, the third thing is international solidarity for the sake of revolution. Is that we, and I as a communist, am anti-racist because if people are racist or chauvinist or we don't try to include everyone, those people will become mercenaries for the bourgeois. The bourgeois will try to use that discrepancy, or maybe they'll use us as mercenaries for them. They will help facilitate fights amongst the working class on the basis of race.
Or under the basis of trans rights.
Yeah,
or something
yes,
like that.
trans
you
rights
have some transphobic, some communist party, that's a no-go.
Yeah, it's unacceptable. One last thing I'll say about this is that also, if you don't include everyone in your movement, even from an economistic union's perspective, those people will become your scabs. They're more likely, when you go on strike, those people will probably continue working. It divides the working class and makes us less strong and makes revolution harder. But if you notice all three of these things, whether we're talking about production, commerce, or international solidarity for the sake of revolution, all of these are practical. And morality comes from this practice, from labor, from class struggle. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to add my 2 cents on this is that this isn't to say that we're like purely utilitarian and that like the only reason I care about black people is because I want a revolution. This is just explaining the material reasons underlying why a communist movement becomes anti-racist.
Yeah, because obviously when I am anti-racist, anti-sexist, or I see sexism or racism, I feel like a disgust.
Yeah.
You know, or a pain that this is unacceptable. But the cause of that is something that's beyond just my whims, you know what I mean? And it's the same with the bourgeois when they're talking about everything in terms of property. It's not just about their whims, it's they materially benefit from that. It's about their praxis of investment.
Yeah, and like the way that our morality enshrines being against stealing and stuff like that. There might have been like some level of that in, like, say, hunter-gatherer societies, but nowhere the way that we fetishize being against stealing, because you just wouldn't have this individual private property the same way.
Yeah.
And so and yes, it's a purely utilitarian thing. It works for the class society. Like, they need to enshrine this, but that doesn't mean that we all, to some varying level, don't feel genuine pangs about stealing. We were socialized to feel it's wrong to steal.
Yeah. And even from a capitalist, you'll even sometimes may have that anxiety. Obviously, capitalists are swine and they don't deserve any of our sympathy. But like, this is where maybe this moral reservations come from, is they control the media and our school system, and they're going to teach us those norms. And some of these norms we might even adopt, and some of them that's okay. I mean, it's more of as we become more conscious, we'll start saying, okay, well, do we want to accept this norm or not? And maybe we have our own reasons for accepting those norms that are based in proletarian practice. One example that I thought of, if you had an anthill and the ants were conscious and had ideology and morality, would their society be meaningfully different? And I would say no.
Assuming that they all have the same physical capacities. Yeah. They carry things with their mouths. All the same things. They have the hive complex, and they carry things to the queen.
And they would create an ideology or rationality for feeding the queen more. Rather than saying, oh, she's caring for 2, they would say she's caring for 1 million or whatever.
Yeah. For the whole group.
Yeah, and whether it's using an appeal to nature, or maybe some kind of mysticism or utilitarianism or whatever, they'd rationalize it, and then there would be like an expectation for collective work amongst the ants, and that would be rationalized. And when different anthills would fight or different colonies would fight, they would probably have some kind of xenophobia or some kind of ideology of justifying that domination.
But the key is it's just a justification. Nothing has changed materially, except that now that they're conscious in some way, they have to rationalize their decisions.
Yes.
How we rationalize not murdering each other.
Well, and that doesn't mean that once we start having that rationality that we can start picking apart the rationality and start making better decisions on the specific material conditions. But there are some things that just aren't going... When we're talking about, okay, we need firewood to keep us warm, and we live in a peasant society without electric heating, we're going to need to chop down some trees to get some wood. And they're going to have to feed the queen more because she's going to have more babies. Now, obviously, we're not mechanistic materialists, but we understand the production, and obviously the ant society doesn't have any class component to it.
Kind of illuminates how morality is more of just this thing that emerges primarily out of material conditions.
Yeah, material conditions, class. I guess the last
yeah,
question.
We still have a couple things.
One last thing I want to say is there any like quote though that's in the Bible that's very like more radical? So I mean, there's like slaves obey your masters, but is there one that's like,
well,
your boss's butt?
Let me think about that for a second. I know we reread something like when in that about Engels saying about like, well, I guess like if you were to look at Revelations, like a lot of it is about. I mean, you could say it's like semi-revolutionary. It's just it's they're talking about this coming age where this isn't the religion of like love your enemy and turn the other cheek. It's like, when will God punish these people? When will they avenge us? There's this idea of like almost torturing them because they tortured us. And in this context, the Christians at the time were like very persecuted. They were thrown in coliseums and to quote unquote fight lions. They're just getting mauled and
there's
destroyed.
a lot of torture of them. And the one thing that I thought was interesting, and I guess this is very political and pretty radical, is that supposedly, according to Engels and the anthropology and theology understanding at the time, they figured out that basically 666, the number of the beast, was actually code for this one of the Caesars.
Yeah,
Nero.
Caesar Nero specifically.
Yeah.
And he was the 5th Caesar, starting from Augustus.
Yes, and that he was the one who...
He was the one that created one of the first big persecutions of Christians. Mm-hmm. So that was definitely what he was known for.
Well, that's me saying Biden is the number of the beast. Or we can all Bush or Congress.
Yeah,
or all
Mitch
the capitalists.
We can even
Jeff
say AOC
Bezos.
for that matter.
Yeah, and all of these. But I like that. I thought that was interesting. And
then there's of course the whole thing, in Jesus says it's easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle than a rich man. Than a rich man to go to heaven, and that's a very anti-rich, and ruling class sentiment. Mm-hmm. And that you're basically saying this person, it's very unlikely that they're going to get to go to heaven. They're going to go to hell and be punished for all time. Mm-hmm. And then there's the story of Lazarus.
Yeah, tell that story. That's interesting.
Yeah, so the story goes. Let me pull up the passage exactly. Oh, the passage is Luke 16, 19 through 31. The story is about the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus is this poor person. He's like a servant in the rich man, quote unquote's house. Mm-hmm. And where he doesn't even get scraps from the master most of the time. And he has wounds and everything. And of course, both of them die. And the rich man goes to hell. The Lazarus, he goes to heaven. And it's kind of this idea of, you finally get justice. And the rich man is pleading for just a dab of water to feel a little, cooler. And he's the story goes, he's burning in hell. So, well, I think he said technically Hades. Yeah. So I think it's Well, doesn't he begs for Lazarus to give him some water? And somebody says to him well, your entire life you had a comfortable, nice life, while Lazarus got nothing and was treated like shit. Yeah.
And now it's the other way around.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because in the way this mechanism, this hatred for the rich, but it was in this only meaningful in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. And that's it takes all of its teeth out of it, and it's kind of perverse in a way. You know, in fact, one thing that's interesting is, didn't it say in John that earlier on they didn't even have an afterlife, right? Or what was it they were saying that?
Well, the afterlife didn't really exist in the Jewish tradition.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. And Christianity was really the one.
Well,
that
and
really
also
pushed.
the Greeks were to live after you're dead was not considered a particularly good thing.
No, it was considered misfortune.
Yeah. Which is interesting. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Okay,
what role does Christianity play in colonialism and imperialism? I think that the key word here is missionaries. Certainly, capitalism does use Christianity in the home front to really push this idea of private property, but in terms of foreign affairs, it's also very present. I mean, you could see how during the Cold War between the Soviets and the U.S., well, between the West and the Eastern Bloc, everything was framed in this Christian versus atheist. That was the dichotomy. Yes. And of course, that's when a lot of these things in our schools were enshrined. Or that's when we started saying the Pledge of Allegiance in schools.
Adding God in it.
Yeah, and then we added "In God We Trust" to the dollar bill at that point. We really used religion as symbolism for the anti-communist ideas floating around. I guess that kind of is a justification for imperialism and fighting for against communism. Mm-hmm. You can also see this in just when the settler colonies were being established in what we now call the United States of America, and the settlers were genociding the indigenous people. We had missionaries going in and trying to convert them, and this was part of a broader plan of trying to westernize them. Mm-hmm. Native Americans were...
Well, it was
like,
a justification for colonialism.
Yes, that too. I mean, it had played multiple roles. Part of it was, turning them into laborers, assimilating them. Part of it, was justification with manifest destiny. Indigenous people were, like, forced into these, like, schools where they would just try to indoctrinate them.
Yeah, the boarding schools where they, like, sanitize their culture. Like,
it's like cultural genocide
in this case. It's so messed up. I mean, you were telling me about how but even today, sometimes you'll have missionaries that will be part of an espionage wing.
Oh, yeah.
And that happens. I mean, like, I feel confident in saying that probably happens in Cuba.
Yeah.
And also, like, obviously that they're involved in moving a lot of money through charities and stuff and just kind of promoting a specific kind of capitalism. But what was it you said that you were part of a missionaries at one point when you were...
I've been in quite a few missionary things while I was part of the evangelical wing of Christianity. There was one where, I went to China, of all places, to like kind of Christianize the people there. At the time, I felt like good in that I wasn't like forcing it on the locals there, but of course, like, there was actually other teams there that were like really forcing it on the locals.
How did they do that?
Well, what they would do is, like, they would give them, because they're, like, in a relationship, kind of. The students are there. Well, they were mostly students we talked to. We were, like, at a school. And the people there were trying to learn English, so that's kind of why the university let us be there. And there would be, like, other groups there that would, like, they were only there for, like, a few weeks, and they would give them, like, a deadline to make a decision. You need to decide if you want to be a Christian or not.
Do you want to go to heaven or hell?
By this Tuesday.
If you want to be able to get an education from us, you have to accept.
Yeah. Well, and it's also just like, there's that extreme social pressure. I would hear about this stuff in my group, and I was like, whoa, what the hell? That's crazy.
And also just the resources that in some communities, like my friend was telling me in Venezuela, with the Yupa, there's an indigenous group on the western side of Venezuela, and they, like, missionaries come there, and they have all these resources. Now, it's not as abusive as it once was, like maybe in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Depends on, like, where you are and which mission. But, like, sometimes it'd be like, okay, you convert to Christianity and you can get our food. Or even today, it's still pretty, like... I mean, it's hard not to... Even if there isn't a condition on food, the kind of just barrier kind of there is... okay, these rich people are coming in and giving us out of the kindness of our heart without understanding that these countries are usually poor and people don't have enough. And they have poor infrastructure and welfare programs. Because the West is systematically stealing from them.
Oh, yes.
Well, let's be clear. The ruling class of the West is stealing from them. Americans get some consumer goods, but in general, there are poor people in America, too.
Overall, we're still, like, hostages in the system.
How would you pay for your mission trips?
Most of the time, the mission trips, I would just do, like, donations, crowdfunding.
You just like sell brownies and be like, please.
Usually I would just call people up and I'm going there to minister to these people, and they're like, yeah, this is great. And of course I would get people, what, you're gonna get thrown in jail? Why do you want to go to China? Or stuff like that. But in general, it was pretty like crowdfunded, for sure. Oh, but, we just kind of briefed on that thing in China, but I would say, like, we were told not to talk about politics, and I think that's, probably a good idea in general, but, like, stuff like this is, you're trying to turn people, like, instill Western values in these people, and I'm sure Christians think, they're really, out of the kindness of their hearts, really trying to, like, save these people from hell and stuff.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
Like, what you're really doing is you're just instilling Western values so you can disrupt the unity in that country. Like China isn't like this united front. Now you have Western elements which could be used, like leveraged as assets in like future Cold Wars and stuff like that. Like that's effectively the role it plays. I mean, like I'm sure there might even be some CIA documents. Maybe they fund this type of stuff in one way or another.
It wouldn't surprise me if this kind of stuff is used in color revolutions and stuff like
that.
Yeah,
it definitely it probably plays a role.
Yeah.
And as we've seen, like in say the USSR, like the church became like a bastion of reactionary ideas and like.
In different times, it was like obviously during the Civil War, it definitely was, and I mean it always is because a lot of this stuff is based in class society. We're talking about like subjugating women. It's very homophobic. A lot of this goes back to slave society and forcing gender roles and forcing women to have children for larger armies and so that you can expand exploitation
and to hopefully increase your slave population.
And China doesn't need any more backward religious stuff. It has the Buddhists in Tibet. And people don't understand how they had a feudalist society that even had slaves in Tibet, and they justified that using reincarnation and karma. That your life was miserable because you must have done something in a life previous to that. And so you justify your servitude to the Lord.
And that's like isn't that the perfect example of that phrase, like for that type of person that's, isn't everything great in the world?
Oh, it's a Pangloss.
A Pangloss.
Pangloss is somebody who,
I could see, like, on an individual level, there's probably a bunch of Panglosses running around. Like, isn't this so great? We're playing a role in it in reincarnation and, like, this universal justice.
Yeah, and the unfolding of God's will or something. Or the Pangloss character is somebody who is from Voltaire's book, Candide, is somebody who puts a absurdly happy spin on everything. That everything is the best possible world. Always also in an academic sense, knows a lot about all these different subjects, so it can justify the status quo. Isn't it convenient that my nose exists in such a way so close to my eyes so it can fit my glasses so conveniently?
It's like, okay, where did glasses come from?
Yeah.
We didn't just blindly make a shape and it's so great, it fits on our face, But
it's like, isn't it great the food tastes so good, without realizing that the history of how taste evolved was co-constructed with our nutritional needs,
the things that we think taste good tend to be the things with high sugar, high fat, essential things for high carbs and high fat, things that are really important for survival. And just the things that we find detesting or detestable are things that usually breed disease.
And that's why I eat too much crappy food. That's the justification that I tell my doctor. But anyway,
is there a Christian ruling class, and how is capital bound up in Christianity?
In America, how does that work?
Well, I think it's definitely very complicated. If you're looking on the Catholic side, you can really just point to the Catholic Church. There's
a lot of money laundering there.
Oh, yeah, and there's an enormous amount of capital in the church itself. Yeah. And the Catholic Church during World War II basically just during during Benito Mussolini's rule, they totally supported him.
Well, because it was a trade for the Vatican becoming its own state. But I guess I'm more of thinking of capitalist proper. So maybe Chick-fil-A, right? The family who owns Chick-fil-A.
Yeah. I was just going on that route because it's a very obvious thing.
Yeah.
Now, on the Protestant side, I do think because the Protestantism more mirrors capitalism, it tends to be a bit more diffuse. It's harder to find, you can't just be everything's the Koch brothers. You know what I mean? There's a huge web of different things.
It's decentralized.
Yes.
It's decentralized. It's not like the Catholic Church where you can point to the bishops and the Pope or whatever bureaucracy.
There definitely are a lot of big figureheads Franklin Graham and stuff.
Well, and there's I mean, you have all these televangelists.
Televangelists.
Those people should be publicly executed.
Yeah.
I mean, liquidated. But they're stealing from the people. I mean, they're hucksters.
I mean, I would say, as an official, a communist podcast, we would, because they're stealing from the working class, we would let the working class decide what to do with them. But we think justice would be done. Yeah. And they might end up getting executed based on the basis that we want to signal to future generations that this is not acceptable.
Yeah. It's unacceptable. And spreading all this hatred, homophobia, and it's
also just swindling working class people.
It's so disgusting.
A lot of times people turn to religion because it brings them a meaning and also helps them survive every day through the horrors of capitalism.
Yeah, it is the opium of the people, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And it's also a part of that quote is it's the heart of a heartless world.
Yeah, there's the spirit of the spiritless condition or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because it is humans trying to impose morality on the existence level of things. Without humans, this kind of in the components of the world where humans have no control, we're trying to impose morality on that where there is none. Mm-hmm. But we have there is morality that's part of our society that's rooted in the history of labor and class and stuff like that,
and just collective society.
And we don't need to throw that away. It's
we didn't need God to determine that we shouldn't murder each other in general.
Yeah, I mean, there may have been a time where people found that this understanding useful, but we've moved beyond that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not necessary, and it's also very. It slows down the revolution.
Yes.
It's not that, we can't have in the future, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, it's to what extent will there be, superstition or, because, I mean, to me, it's not, horrible if somebody believes in some kind of
astrology or something.
Well, I mean, I think we need to try to get rid of that out in schools, but it's okay if people believe in some kind of something that's a weird tradition that's kind of wrong.
Or that whole idea, it's bad luck. You say you do some tick, you have to throw salt behind your back. That type of stuff.
Obviously,
it's relatively harmless. Even though we would say it's inaccurate.
And we would obviously teach that in schools that it's inaccurate. Yeah. But some of this stuff will just happen, or it will just kind of turn into stories that maybe people might appreciate, and maybe some people believe more than others. That might become something like Santa. I mean, but in general, I think. It's very important to teach people about materialism and dialectics. Mm-hmm. Boys and girls, go out and read Materialism and the Dialectical Method by Maurice Cornforth. This is PLP endorsement.
Anyways, going back on track, we were talking about institutions that support capital or Christianity.
Wait, one last thing I want to say.
Well, there's corporations like Hobby Lobby. And Chick-fil-A, it's a very notable one. Chick-fil-A, has been known to support groups in Africa that were
very homophobic.
They did actual I guess they were
they
supporting...
would hunt gay people, right? They would literally kill them and
I think that's how it
trans
went.
People.
Yeah. So it's just very reactionary, very terrible. Of course, they also just lobby the U.S. government at one point or another against, legalizing gay marriage. And a lot of these,
I know, Hobby Lobby wanted to giving health care that would provide birth control.
Yes, birth control, because it was against their religious beliefs.
Yeah.
You see a lot of these things where maybe it's a little decentralized, but these capital is. Influencing policy, and they have power because they have capital.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one thing I was talking to my comrade here the other day is just realizing how petty bourgeois a lot of the clergy are. Because literally they went to college and they got this thing where where they can spend their entire time studying and just kind of making up feel-good statements. And there is some therapy involved, but a lot of it is just drawing upon these stories that are outdated as if they have some kind of necessarily supernatural power. Mm-hmm. And they're not actually creating anything for the people. In fact, they're holding the people back. Mm-hmm. And one thing to study about the history of theology in your free time. It's another thing to expect us to listen to that bullshit.
Yeah.
How is new atheism reactionary, and what is wrong with their philosophy?
Where to start? Well, let's just start with the history of them. You have the four biggest figures, or the four of new atheism are the four horsemen of the non-apocalypse.
Is that what they say? Do they actually say?
Yes, that's what that's what the four horsemen means. Very on the nose.
Yeah.
You got Sam Harris, who wrote the End of Faith. That's one of his big books. You have Richard Dawkins, who wrote every atheist that's ever read it is the God Delusion. Christopher Hitchens. One of his main works is God Is Not Great, and then I guess you have a fourth one.
Daniel Dennett, but he's not as. I don't think he's as in the limelight.
Yeah.
He's a liberal. Yeah. But I haven't heard as much reactionary stuff come from him.
If you look at the first three, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris, their discussions just have so much of anti-Muslim hate. Mm-hmm. I guess a great example of this is Christopher Hitchens. He opposed the Vietnam War on anti-imperialist grounds, but would come for the invasion of Iraq. He supported that. Mm-hmm. He went from being more of the likes of Noam Chomsky to meeting with White House people.
Well, he became a neocon.
Yes, yeah. And basically, the problem with these three people in New Atheism is they reduce everything to just being about religion versus atheism. They think religion is the cause of all issues.
It's about bad ideas.
Yes, it's very idealist.
Yeah.
They'll point to specific events, fight between the Irish and the Catholics and the Protestants, and they turn it all into just religion when there's material components to that. Or
like settler colonialism.
Yeah. They just reduce everything to religion. And we as Marxists just oppose that because it's just not accurate.
Well, it's very idealist. It thinks that ideas drive history. When a lot of this anti-Islamic sentiment was very conveniently worked with American empire. Mm-hmm. And they would say, the reason that there might be some kind of more terrorism in the Middle East is because of their ideas, not looking at the fact that America is actively, and a lot of Europe and different nations in the West are actively, especially America, are destroying a lot of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And this radicalizes a lot of those people, and they support people like Saddam, who kill all the communists, and different people to call the communists, whether we're talking about in Afghanistan or Iraq, or the Saudis are no friends of communists. Mm-hmm. What you have left is using religion to fight empire. Mm-hmm. It's not about bad ideas, and that's one thing I wanted to say.
Well, they do have bad ideas, but that's not the reason they're radical.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is these people see all systems of ideas, whether we're talking about scripture or ideology, as a list of statements to be proven right or wrong. It's not, there isn't a class character or some overarching narrative that you can see within these ideologies according to them. Mm-hmm. And it's just very static, it's very positivist. This hyper logic bro that doesn't try to see things inside the historical context. When we see a given ideology, it's not about just a list of statements to be proven right or wrong. It's a map. An ideology is a map towards human liberation for a given class, for a given people. They might understand that in different ways, whether that's the afterlife or maybe a petty bourgeois, or a bourgeois might understand liberation through property. Mm-hmm. How often do you hear somebody say, well, why don't you start up your own little local business and your life will get better? Or whether it's a Christian who's talking about liberation through the afterlife, or if we're talking about communism, like human liberation comes through revolution to get rid of exploitation, and then we can truly, as an individual, figure out what it means to be free and liberate ourselves. But you first have to liberate the collective. But it's just very idealist, and it's not trying to understand what was going on in the time that religion was made. And it sees everything in terms of rationality and irrationality, which is kind of funny that they supported the Iraq War, because I would say that's pretty irrational.
Yeah,
but anyway.
yeah, especially with everything we know now, it's just...
Well, but I mean,
I kind of knew it at the time,
yeah.
too. But like the government has finally admitted to it.
Well, I mean, it was about trying to make sure that Iraqi oil was sold using the American dollar, and to expand the American dollar's usage and get rid of another enemy.
Well, also to just have those markets, privatized markets.
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein, he was planted there by the U.S., and it wasn't until he started nationalizing
we supported him.
That we stopped supporting him.
Yeah.
A good summary is just that the problem with the new atheists is, yes, they serve a very specific class. They hate religion, but they specifically hate Islam the most. And they use that to further U.S. empire and just capitalist empire.
Yeah. And they're not trying to understand why people do given things. It's just purely based off of abstract beliefs, not how did they form those beliefs, and why within a given religion do those beliefs change over time. It's just, for them, the scriptures is almost even more important than the people who believe in the scripture. You know, in the USSR, there was for a long time they didn't allow children to go to church. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that, like, it's a very hard, like...
I'm sure a lot of religious people would find that very, like, offensive, but I also think, there's, if you were to talk to a lot of these new atheism folks, I mean, and they have a lot of issues, but I think, some of their takes are, like, rather rational. Like, this is indoctrination, and, if we're in, like, a socialist society run by a communist party, we need to, like, there's this outer pro-capitalist propaganda or reactionary propaganda, and we have to make sure that our propaganda is stronger than theirs. Part of that is we don't want you indoctrinating our kids and telling, and this is where, like, the new atheism comes in. They argue that it's like a form of torture, telling the kids that they'll be sent to hell from such a young age.
Well, yeah, 'cause I remember as a kid, like, crying because I had a friend that thought that, like, I was going to hell because I wasn't a Christian.
Yeah, that's just terrible.
Yeah. But it's.
And I think, the argument that it's torture or it's traumatic is very valid. And of course I understand why, like, Christians or other religious folks, they care about their kids, and if they genuinely think they're going to hell, it's one of those things. But, like, if we are promoting, like, society based in materialism and we're looking for, like, the common good of everyone, I don't think we want to have that, allow that. That's not good for them. You wouldn't let your kid be indoctrinated into becoming, like, a terrorist. So, like, we would, as a society, decide that's not good. I think we can also draw the line at like, just all religion. They can, maybe we can teach about all the religions at some point.
Well, I think
alongside teaching materialism specifically.
This is what I think is, like, we should teach religion as a form of anthropology. And as a history, like, as you see on early Christianity in Engels, Engels wrote, I think there is definitely a lot of culture there that I think people do want to keep to a certain extent. It's just, this is obviously steeped in class society. I mean, I personally make a difference between, like, spirituality and religion as an institutional thing. Sure. Like, to me, institution... I don't think Quakers are as harmful because, like, Quakers have this kind of radically egalitarian notion.
Very collective society, too.
Well, and there is a history in the United States of that even Engels studied of utopian socialists that came to America.
Really?
Yeah, in fact, like the Shakers are a good example of that. The Shakers, they set up like little communes all over America, and they were huge into gender equality. They believed the second coming had already happened, so it was their obligation to make heaven on earth here, which is more materialist in that you had to build something here rather than afterwards.
I can see a lot of Christians saying that's heretical, but it actually is much more based.
Yeah.
But your average Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that the beauty of dialectical materialism is that, or historical materialism, is that we can understand these from like a meta framework. Like, why were they doing that? Mm-hmm. Why were these different societies doing that? Like when we're talking about the Christians, oh, well, it's because they were enslaved. Or in these different sects case, a lot of them, they saw the Anglican Church as part of this that was very similar to Catholicism, as like overbearing on their daily lives, and they were fed up with capitalist society. A lot of times they actually spoke out against consumerism. Even like this is early on in capitalism too. You know, which
now it's so obvious, but back then, you know.
Well, it's interesting because like sometimes I can talk to a Christian on the basis of consumerism. Like, look at how this like ruins all like culture.
Yeah, I can definitely say, coming from a Christian family, everyone definitely, well, they call it materialism. You know, which I really dislike, but like they're really critiquing consumerism, and they would say they're, you know, you should be thinking in terms of like your future in heaven and stuff. But I mean, I think their criticisms are valid when they criticize consumerism specifically. I mean, they're not usually criticizing like strong bonds between families and like helping each other, which are like material things. Specifically criticizing this incessant need to like hoard wealth in a sense and hoard possessions and everything like that. Well, and also base your life on acquiring new things.
Well, yeah, and Christmas becomes more about giving random shit.
Yes.
And
like stuff that nobody wants in the first place.
Yeah, well, but it's just the culture of getting things, you know, and buying things. And that's partially because of bourgeois propaganda. I mean, no, it's almost holistically because of that. Yeah. I mean, back in the day, you might have a gift here or there, but it was made, you know, maybe it was some kind of rare fruit that you got once in a while. Now, it's kitsch. It's crap that is manufactured by the bourgeois, and the demand is manufactured by the bourgeois. And people don't have any time to make anything anymore. So there's no, like, true act of kindness and love. It's just like, oh, I'm just buying you this shit because it's part of a tradition of buying.
Because I feel like I need to buy stuff. Yes.
And there's a little bit of love there, but at the end of the day, we're just buying trash that's made by slaves. Yes. And then you have the speculators or the gamblers gambling on the trash making the trash made by slaves.
It's like a whole industry.
And then you have companies that sell stock, that invest in stock, and so they're gambling on the gamblers that gamble on the trash made by slaves. My God. And then it's sold. That trash is made by slaves is sold under a Christmas tree with a little angel on top of the tree. But
well, they got one thing right: the mythology of Santa with his elves in the workshops. There definitely are people in sweatshops doing this stuff. It's and it is in a land far away from you, where you don't know the people.
Well, no, there was one time when I was a kid where I thought about making a book. It would be like a multi-factional, like North Pole war that would involve the elves also revolting. There was like a civil war, but then also the Yetis were involved, and these people had different cultures with different games and stuff. But anyway, let's get back on topic. What is the?
We could definitely talk about that another episode.
Yeah.
Is there? How is the philosophy of Christianity antithetical to Marxism?
We kind of already answered that.
Yeah, I guess we did. We talked about like their conception and just like dogmatic morality versus ours, which is material.
Another thing I wanted to just re-emphasize was it's very misogynistic. One thing I wanted to mention again about the Shakers, like part of the reason they rejected the Anglican Church was how misogynistic it was, you know, and So they kind of created this dualism. They thought that God was like one part woman, one part man, which is interesting to say God is man and woman, because a lot of people, that's more of a new thing that people will say. But I feel
nowadays
like if you
a lot
back,
of feminists will say God is a woman.
Well, there's that, but there's also, in modern day, people will say, oh, God is neither, or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
But if you went back like a couple hundred years, they would say, no, God is a he, like, but in that society, they said it was both, so that's interesting. But it's, I guess, the biggest thing, again, to reiterate this, is basically, we believe that we have to make the world fair, that morality is within humanity and humanity's labor and class struggle, whereas they say morality is imposed by God and God will make things right.
Yeah.
I have had conversations with people, I start telling them, they agree with me, like the world is so fucked. But then the minute that it gets too dicey, and I'm talking about climate change, I'm talking about exploitation and imperialism, and just everyday people who are working 13 hours a day. I'm even talking to people who are working 13 hours a day, and they could be spending that time with their family. But then it stops short when they say, look, I understand this world is unfair, but we're going to get another world after we die.
Yeah.
And so it's a complete...
It's so disheartening.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, it's a great mechanism for preventing revolt.
Yeah, this is a great way to diffuse revolutionary energy. Yeah. Now you're just you're like, everything is so fucked. We need to convert more people to Christianity so we can have this in the next world after we die. Right? Let's convert people to communism, and then let's bring a revolution and change things now. And so we don't have to do this now, rather than let's wait till after we're dead.
One thing I forgot to mention with the colonialism, you see this in Brazil. So originally they're Catholic, but a lot of the elites and stuff have converted into Protestantism.
Really?
Yes, and it's imported from the United States. And a lot of these people do not like the carnival or a lot of the culture where it's like, having these celebrations with crazy costumes.
Isn't that Bolsonaro?
Yeah, Bolsonaro, but a lot of these Protestants hate that. But anyway, let's continue, sorry.
What is the history of Marxist-Leninism and religion?
I think we talked a little bit about that.
We definitely touched on it, like the USSR and churches, how the churches were somewhat reactionary.
One thing, certain rounds where they purged a lot of the Orthodox priests, they did allow them to exist, and they were constantly trying to tweak propaganda or just how to communicate a secular society to the masses. In the Cultural Revolution, they, of course, got rid of a lot of backward stuff. Specifically, Tibet, they helped get rid of all of this feudalist nonsense that was justified through reincarnation and slavery.
Well, wouldn't that be despotism?
If you get a chance to, I'd highly recommend reading. Parenti has a good thing on Tibet. What were you going to say? Sorry.
Wouldn't it be despotism if it had slaves?
They had both.
Oh, okay.
In fact, it's also interesting to note, even in the beginning of feudalism, it wasn't immediate. There were still slaves. As the Roman Empire was falling apart, and hundreds of years after, it took a while for there to be more full transition. I mean, you see the divine right of kings. It's just a justification for class authority.
Just like you see today, you have these... I don't know, the other day somebody shared with me, some evangelical Christian, he has a channel where he's waving a flag and he's at a campfire and he's all talking about Christianity and bringing back this ideal to America, which is fetishizing private property like it's a part of the Bible or something. And it's that's definitely not really in the Bible. You can just cherry pick things, but no matter what, this is a very reactionary thing. And is used to turn working class people that could otherwise become revolutionary, maybe even within a liberation theology framework or something. They may not be Marxist, but turn them from at least some level of revolutionary position into loving capitalism.
Yes. Well, and it's funny because back to the revolutionary potential, the more radical components of Christianity. what was it? Didn't Jesus push over they were like selling something in the church and...
Oh, yeah, turning the tables of the Pharisees, because they were turning their, selling the animals they were going to use for the sacrifices. And he called them, this is a thieves' den, this is supposed to be the Lord's house, but you've turned it into a den of thieves, is like the quote.
You turned it into a bank. No, but it is interesting how a lot of, instead of the 10 Commandments, we have this Constitution, we have a lot of economists.
Well, you do have the 10 Commandments too in a lot of justice houses.
But I mean, you have a lot of economists act like clergy.
Yes.
Especially peddling this austerity bullshit, trying to justify basically the rich keeping, the capitalists keeping everything.
Well, it's this idea. Well, actually, the people in poor nations, that we're exploiting, actually their living standard is increasing. So we should just keep doing this forever.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't matter that they're all like really upset with us and there's crazy unhappiness there. There's like instability and everything. But what we're doing works.
Yeah.
So we should just keep going at it, even
even
if we know they're poor.
Is this just an extension of the prosperity gospel we discussed before?
Well, the prosperity gospel is more about the idea you should give more money to the church because then you'll get it tenfold from God.
Oh, okay.
So it's just like an excuse to be a charlatan. Even more.
It's like investing. Instead of investing in Amazon, you're giving it to
some
Pat
church.
Robertson.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna expand on that. It's also like fetishizes getting wealthy too. You can't say that doesn't matter. That isn't having an influence on people.
Yeah.
Creating this sentiment that all that matters is, and now like wealth is a sign that you're favored by the Lord.
Well, it's literally taking the metrics of capitalism's success and justification of, because you have a lot of money, you supposedly contributed the most to society, you deserve it, you're a good person for it, and then turning it into a religious one.
Yes, like merging religion with capitalism.
Mm-hmm. It's really sad because, after you read on
the early Christians or
by Engels, you're like, it's fascinating how this was co-opted by the state and by the at the time the slave, the masters and the lords and stuff.
Yeah, and then turned into adopted by the feudalist order and then adopted by the capitalist order.
Literally the divine right of kings.
Yeah,
divine right of kings is crazy, and to think that the supposedly 666 or 616. Which were supposedly like interchangeable. Yeah,
just based off of what
was Nero.
Yeah. Well, and just it's based off it. Kaiser Nero is. It just depends on which language you're translating from. Is it from Latin or is it from Hebrew?
Yeah.
That's the Hebrew is 666. The Latin one is 616. Yeah, because they. It's like a bunch of numerology.
Yeah, no. One thing I was talking to my comrade here is whether we're talking about like a secular person studying religion, a non-secular person, a religious person studying religion. Sometimes you actually have to look into the numerology because it's actually written into the religion. Mm-hmm. It's not something I was raised in a very secular family. I did not know that. I thought that was just something that other people added onto it, but it really was these priests and clergy that was part of...
Yeah, it was part of their beliefs and also part of...
Well, probably was part of the justification, just like you could maybe certain societies, it was mixed in with astronomy.
Well, a great example is solar calendar and stuff like that. 7 days and everything.
Well, yes. But I guess what I would say is like, you might be able to show somebody some algebra with relation to some kind of words and be like, look, that's not a coincidence.
Some of these people
but the people didn't
InfoWars.
Yeah, but the people don't. Yeah, but the people don't know how to read.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really That's one thing I realized is how much literacy just changes how much I expect from somebody. If somebody's in Roman times and they're committing all these war crimes and doing all these horrible things, they don't know how to read. Mm-hmm. They're part of this larger structure that's convincing them. But if you know how to read, you have the ability to counteract
be able to
that.
critically think.
Yeah, well, it just helps. I mean, nowadays you have social media that also erases everyone's illiteracy. It's almost, it starts you back at zero. But anyway, let's continue.
The last question we have is, can we think of Christian organizations that are antithetical to communism? I think I would start with just the things we talked about with how Christians fetishize private property. I think that's like very much against communism, just like the prosperity gospel. These aren't specific institutions, but these are lumps of groups. Or in one case, it's some YouTube influencer that's popular among evangelicals. And I think it's really just more seeped into the entire religion overall.
Well, you were saying that don't they have these conferences where you have all these priests that,
That's like an example of institutions of just like Christianity in general. Like, you have the Southern Baptist groups. Like a few years ago, they met to determine, are we going to endorse gay marriage or not? Surprise, surprise, they didn't. We all knew this was coming. They have groups like that. I guess I would probably have to do a little more research on specifically anti-communist churches.
I think a lot of Christianity has just been kind of cowed by liberalism. Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of right opportunism right now that says, religion is in the way of capitalism. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, maybe back in the day. Like you're telling me today.
Maybe like back in the day, as if we go back to the 1600s, in some obscure European town, they might be like the patron saint of the forest. You can't cut down the forest for profit. But now it's just our traditions are interwoven with capitalism. Mm-hmm. They've made peace with the church a long time ago. I mean, the church has made peace with capitalism a long time ago. I mean, you see some struggles in Latin America that have used the church to fight capitalism, which we don't agree with that approach.
I mean, because it's not completely materialist. It's also supporting usually the pink wave, which is still not really. It's anti-imperialist, but it's not truly pro-communist.
Well, I was thinking. I mean, you have the ELN, but I mean, at the end of the day, it seems they're not trying to get rid of money. Mm-hmm. And once you have money, that accumulation will probably start back up. I think also it kind of slows you down. Christianity, it makes you have sympathy for your enemies. I mean, these people, there's a line from Marx that's, what is it? We have no compassion and we ask no compassion from you. When our turn comes, we will not make excuses for the terror. He's saying that back in the past, the bourgeois had revolutions and sometimes they made excuses, or like they would abuse us and make excuses. But we don't need to make excuses. These people are part of a system that abuses the proletariat all around the world. Mm-hmm. We see people working in mines and day in, day out, and children spreading DDT on bananas and just the most horrible stuff that you can imagine.
And also like capitalists cutting corners with safety.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's one thing to
Amazon, you see that all the time.
It's one thing to have like a society that's, we really need these materials. So we'll come up with some fair system where, say you do this, there's some health risks, and we'll give you a few years off of your work time because we know this might be reducing your life. Your life period or something, but you're doing something very valuable for society. Oh, and of course we'll give you masks and do everything we can to make sure you're safe in that mine. But yeah, it's another thing to
we'd probably
totally
take
exploit
turns
them.
too. We would make everything better it would just be significantly better, and we'd only take what we needed. Okay, we need iron for public transportation and for wheelchairs and stuff like that. We wouldn't be just aimlessly making trash for profit. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's
Well, I'm sure we would probably jumpstart the automation thing. We should automate these unsafe jobs as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And of course, you won't have these working class people against it because it will benefit them. That they won't have to do an unsafe job, and we'll make sure they're relocated into something they're passionate about. Nowadays, automation is at their expense. Now they just don't have a job, and say there's someplace in Appalachia where there's just no other opportunities. In a communist society, we would come up with a solution that works for them.
Yeah.
And maybe we would automate it, but we would find some other way to give them something to do that benefits society and is meaningful to them.
Most likely we'd probably switch to nuclear, and you wouldn't have coal as much involved, but there's always something to be done.
Yeah.
The last thing, they were trying to bring down Rome. And from that perspective, it was like the most totalizing thing. Actually, this is a really good thing to end on, because imagine being in the 100 AD or 200 AD and thinking about how we're trying to stop Rome, this empire that it seems impossible to bring down. And we are trying to stop capitalism, which is of a much greater magnitude. Obviously, it's in a different time period, and it's not a specific country or one institution or anything. But they were both trying to take down a Leviathan, a great enemy that seems it's almost impossible to break down. But Rome did fall apart. It's important to realize everything changes. And in this day and age, we really have a potential to organize for communism. Society's falling apart, but we can rebuild a new one. We just have to organize as workers. We got to organize as soldiers and workers against the status quo and for communism.
I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah, that's good.
For sure.
That's good. Peace, love, and revolution.
Oh, I love to get into my clean bed with the sheets so fair and white. And when I am in my clean bed, I sleep through most of the night. And my dreams are hardly troubled by the worrying of my mind for the workers who die of the brown lung in the mills of Caroline. Oh, the mystical people, they think they are wise, with the smooth on their faces, the stars in their eyes. But the truths of this system are spoken and sung by the workers who bear the brown lung. Oh, it's Burlington and Stevens and the names we wives know well, who advertise the sheets and towels and give us the old soft sell. And they'd rather buy the government man with promotions here and there than pay out company profits to clean the cotton mill air. Oh, the mystical people, they think they are wise, with the smooth on their faces, the stars in their eyes. But the truths of the system are spoken and sung by the workers who bear the brown lung. Well, some people talk of the yin and yang and move in a karma days, as though the influence of the stars could change mill owners' ways. But the people who work in the cotton mills, they know how the world is run, and they need some help of an earthly kind to live their time in the sun. Oh, the mystical people, they think they are wise, with the smooth on their faces, the stars in their eyes. But the truths of this system are spoken and sung by the workers who bear the brown lung. Oh, the mystics, they wear the blue jeans, but their heads are in the stars, and they do not know how the denim is made of the years of workers' wars. And my place is not in an ivory tower seeking some power divine, but it's out on the bricks with the union folks at the mills in Caroline. All the mystical people, they think they are wise, with the smooth on their faces and the stars in their eyes. But the truths of the system are spoken and sung by the workers